Matthew here, your BRS beginner guru, and welcome to part 3 in our 10-ish part series where I show you how to set up your first saltwater aquarium by showing you exactly how I do it. Last episode was huge because we did rock, scape, and sand, but today is just as big, maybe even bigger, because we need to discuss water, RODI filtration, salt, and heaters. You've got tap water, filtered water, mineral water, distilled water, spring water, alkaline water, RODI water. That's just a few off the top of my head, and it's important to know the difference because in the saltwater aquarium hobby, we can't just use any old water. Tap water, for example, comes with all sorts of nutrients that we don't want to add to our tanks. A lot of municipal water sources add chlorines and chloramines to their water, and tap water is usually high in phosphates and nitrates. While chlorine and chloramines are universally terrible for our animals, excess nitrates and phosphates in the water will likely fuel nuisance algae growth. Even if your tap water is pretty clean, there are all sorts of major, minor, and trace elements that can slowly build up in your tank and even get absorbed into your sand bed and rock work, and over time it could lead to some pretty bad consequences. Because of this, we are only going to use certain types of filtered water. There are basically 3 ways you can go about it. The first is where a lot of hobbyists start. It's just by going to their local fish store and purchasing pre-made seawater. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing this. It's just a big hassle and will cost you more money in the long run. The second option is to purchase filtered water either from your local fish store or from your local grocery store and make the seawater at home. This is a completely feasible option, and in fact, for a lot of beginners, it's what I actually recommend. You can usually pick up a gallon of RODI water from your local fish store from around 50 to 75 cents per gallon, or you can buy filtered water from your local grocery store, but you can't just get any old water off the shelf. We don't want to use mineral or spring water because these probably have a lot of nutrients that we just don't want to add to our tanks. What I recommend doing is just checking the label for the filtered water. It's probably just RO water or reverse osmosis water. It's not going to be quite as clean as RODI water, but it will be good enough to get started. So if you go the grocery store route, you could just pick up a whole bunch of single gallon containers, or you can get one of those big 5-gallon jugs and fill it at the store yourself because that's just RO water. Some people wonder if you can use distilled water. Absolutely, you can use distilled water. It is extremely pure, and I've never seen or heard of people having problems with copper. I think copper in distilled water is probably one of those old wives' tales, or it's in such low amounts that our tanks wouldn't even notice it. You may still be wondering, Matthew, are you absolutely sure? Can't I just use tap water? I would say that there are a small percentage of people out there that have tap water that is good enough to use in a saltwater aquarium, but for the vast majority of hobbyists, I just think it's not a great idea. There are, of course, some water tests you can perform yourself. You can get chlorine and chloramine strips. You can test for nitrates and phosphates. You can even pick up a TDS meter, which tests the total dissolved solid content of your water. Your local municipal water company will likely publish an annual water report, and you can go to their website and download it, which I've actually done, but there was so much information that I really didn't find it helpful because I don't have an advanced degree in water management. Another problem with using tap water is depending on where you live, the water source may be different throughout the year. For example, I talked with some of my colleagues in Minnesota, and they said depending on where they live, some parts of the year the water is pulled directly from the river, while other parts of the year it is pulled from a reservoir, and the two water sources are wildly different. If you were only going to put fish in your system, no other animals, then yes, you could probably get away with using tap water, but since we're going to be adding quite a few sensitive creatures, tap water just isn't going to work for us. So now that we've determined that using an RODI filter is going to ensure long-term success, we have a lot to talk about. RODI stands for reverse osmosis deionization. It is a type of filter that actually runs water through 4 different filtration elements. elements. The first stage is a sediment filter, which will filter out any large particulate matter. Think of things like pieces of dust, paint chips, dirt, little twigs, that sort of thing. Water then moves to the second chamber, which is the carbon filter. Carbon is really fantastic, especially at removing chlorine and chloramines. Most municipal water sources do add chlorine and or chloramines to the water, and that's why it's really important to use a carbon block. Activated carbon also helps remove colors and smells so that the water comes out looking and smelling super clean. Stage 3 is the reverse osmosis membrane. This stage uses water pressure to force pure H2O through a membrane while leaving behind any water that's contaminated. The result is that clean water continues to the fourth stage while the dirty water is expelled from the unit, and you can just put that water down the drain or collect it to water your plants. The fourth and final stage is the deionization resin. This stage has a whole bunch of charged beads which can remove any remaining contaminants that happen to make it through the reverse osmosis membrane. Once the water passes through all four of those stages, what's usually left is completely pure water, and you can test that yourself by picking up one of these TDS meters. It should read 0 parts per million. But if this is your first time setting up an RODI filter, which it most likely is since this is your first saltwater tank, it can be pretty daunting. I mean, just look at this thing. I mean, it looks super confusing, and trying to set it up may seem like a monumental task, but let me tell you this one thing. If you take the time to learn how to do it now, you will save hundreds, nay, maybe over $1,000 in its first couple years alone. Just to add water initially to this tank, if I was to go to my local fish store and purchase pre-made seawater, it's going to cost me $45. Then every week when I do a 15-gallon water change, it's going to cost me an additional $15, so a little bit over $60 a month. If you add that all together over a year, it's over $700 plus the initial fill up. You're looking at almost $800 in saltwater costs for that first year alone if you don't make the water at home. Instead of doing this, you can save yourself a lot of time and a lot of hassle by purchasing a $250 to $300 RODI filter and just making it all for yourself at home. One thing I've heard from multiple people is that you shouldn't drink RODI water. Why would that be? Well, they say the water is actually too pure and can actually suck nutrients out of your body. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know that if you're using RODI water in a freshwater system, you actually have to add minerals back in because the water's too pure for those fish. So I figure if water's too pure for the fish, maybe it's too pure for us as well. So just don't drink RODI water. Our goal with an RODI filter is to make water that reads 0 TDS, total dissolved solids, meaning basically it's the purest water we can have. Okay, Matthew, you might be saying, all right, easy peasy, I'm just gonna head to the Bulk Reef Supply website and pick up an RODI filter. You would think that would be a simple thing, but go to the website, scroll to RODI filters, and then just start scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. It seems like there is a never-ending selection. You can get 4-stage, 5-stage, 6-stage, 7-stage, value plus. Do you want one that makes 75 gallons a day, or 100 gallons a day, or 150 gallons a day, or 200 gallons per day? Which DI resin bed do you choose? Do you have an anion, a cation, or a mixed bed resin? And how about carbon blocks? Some are designed for chlorines, others are specifically designed for chloramines. Why are there so many options, and how are you supposed to know which one to choose? I mean, it's incredibly overwhelming, but if you just remember that every RODI system has the same 4 filtration elements: the sediment filter, the carbon block, the RO membrane, and the DI resin, and the rest are just add-ons. But instead of losing your mind and trying to figure out which is the exact one, I would recommend just getting this one. The Bulk Reef Supply 4-stage value plus 150 gallon per day RODI system. For me, it's a really good middle ground between a super basic system and a system with a lot more stages. The beautiful thing about RODI filters is they are modular, and and you can change and add to them as you see fit. Just keep in mind that you're not wedded to this exact setup. As you learn more about your water, as you go through this hobby, you can add other filtration elements, but my guess is for the vast majority of you out there, this 4-stage filter is gonna work just fine. What I do like about this system are 3 things. First, instead of making 75 gallons per day, it doubles that to 150 gallons per day by adding a second RO membrane. How that works is after water goes through the first RO canister, the wastewater from that canister is rerouted up to the second RO membrane, giving it another chance to be purified. The end result is you make clean water twice as fast and use half the amount of water. My second favorite thing about this system is the dual inline TDS meter. Because of where the TDS meters are placed, once you learn to read the results, the meter will tell you when it's time to replace your RO membrane and or your DI resin. We don't need to go into how to do this now, but just know that it's there as you progress and get more knowledgeable in this hobby. The third thing I like about the system is the included pressure gauge. RODI systems need a minimum pressure of 50 psi to operate efficiently. A water pressure approaching and exceeding 90 psi is too high and can cause leaks, especially at the junctions where the RO tubing enters the push connect fittings. An ideal range for an RODI filter is 70 to 80 psi. While it's highly unlikely that your home's water pressure is over 90 psi, it is much more likely that your home's psi is below 50, especially if you live in an older house. If that's the case, it's not a big deal. You will be able to read the water pressure gauge, and you can always add a booster pump to raise the water pressure if necessary, but that's a conversation for another day. Although you can get up to 150 gallons per day of clean water from one of these systems, that assumes that you have a water pressure of 70 to 80 psi. If your water pressure is 50-ish, then don't expect your unit to make that much water each day. Another great reason to make your own RODI water at home is evaporation, because these are tropical warm water tanks. No matter where you live, there is going to be a lot of daily evaporation. Since I live here in the desert and it's very dry, especially in the summer times when we keep our house at 78 degrees, I wouldn't be surprised if this tank evaporates like a half gallon, maybe even more than that each day. When water evaporates, the salt stays behind in the tank, so in order to make sure your salinity level doesn't increase, you need to add RODI water to the tank every day. And having an RODI filter just makes it that much easier, so you don't constantly have to run to your local fish store or grocery store. I always like to have filtered water on hand, and if you actually look to the corner of my studio, you will see a 50-gallon white drum as well as a 32-gallon Brute trash can. The 50-gallon drum contains my pre-made seawater, and the 32-gallon Brute trash can contains RODI water. Not only is it super convenient to have this water on hand and ready to go, it's also safer in case there's an accident with your tank. Just to give you an example, a couple months ago, I made a serious mistake with my Hello Reef tank. During my weekly maintenance, I was cleaning one of my pumps with citric acid, and it accidentally turned on and started pumping citric acid-laden water directly into my tank. I didn't notice anything was wrong until one of my clownfish literally jumped out of the tank and onto the floor. I looked inside the tank and the other fish was doing poorly as well. Luckily, I figured out quickly what happened, and because I had pre-made salt water in the corner, I was able to set up an immediate temporary tank to put all of my animals while I fix the problem in the Hello Reef tank. Even when we're being super careful in this hobby, sometimes accidents just happen, and having either freshly made seawater or RODI water on hand is always a safe thing to do. You can choose to either set up your RODI filter inside, attached to one of your faucets, or you can run it outside, attached to a spigot. Here's a view of my outdoor RODI system. I actually mounted the RODI filter above this 50-gallon drum, and inside the 50-gallon drum I have installed a float valve, which is amazing because I don't even have to remember to turn my system off, because once the water level gets full enough, the float valve automatically turns the system off. Before I show you how to install an RODI system, let me walk you through exactly how I use my system. Since I do a weekly water change on all of my tanks, I make fresh RODI water weekly. I start by turning on the water, Then I open up the flush valve. The flush valve is located above the RO canisters and is the mechanism that allows pressure to build up inside the RO membranes so that they function properly. But what can happen over time is a whole bunch of those total dissolved solids can build up in the RO membrane, and if you don't flush them out regularly, you can end up with this phenomena known as TDS creep, whereby whenever you turn the system on for the first time, a whole bunch of total dissolved solids gets added into your clean water, which is obviously what we're trying to avoid in the first place. So what I do every time I start running my RODI filter is I turn the flush valve to the inline parallel position and let it run for 30 seconds to a couple minutes to flush all of that gunk out of the RO membranes. Then I simply turn the flush valve 90 degrees to the perpendicular position, and now I'm making RODI water. All of my clean RODI water goes down through this blue RO tube and into the 50-gallon drum. The dirty water for me just goes to the ground and then flows into the garden to water the plants. I did install this float valve, like I already mentioned, which will automatically apply back pressure when full, so it will stop the RODI filter. Now, to make my life even easier, what I did is I put a Sicce Ultra Zero utility pump at the bottom of my 50-gallon barrel. These things are fantastic, and I actually have 3 of them, and I highly recommend you get one to make your life a lot easier. The Sicce Ultra Zero pump is attached to a long garden hose with a python hook at the end. I drilled a hole in the 50-gallon barrel and installed a uniseal for the hose to go through. This way, all I need to do in order to make fresh seawater or to transfer RODI water into my storage containers is to pull the garden hose into my house and turn the pump on. I've made my life even easier by using smart outlets, so in order to transfer water from outside to inside the house, I just have to open up the app and click the on button. If you end up going this route, be sure you set a timer, because I forgot to do this a month ago, and my son comes in and says, "Why is there water all over the floor?" And sure enough, I totally forgot, and water was pouring over the sides of my Brute trash can all over the floor. Luckily, when we remodeled the home a few years ago, I was sure to install waterproof flooring because I knew something like this would happen. I'll go over this more in the future, but just an FYI, I also have a Sicce Ultra Zero connected to garden hoses and python hooks for both my RODI water trash can as well as my seawater 50-gallon barrel. This way I don't have to constantly move water around my studio. I can just hook the python over the edge of the tank, use a smart outlet to turn it on and off, and it's that much easier for me. Okay, I'm finally going to show you how to set up your own RODI filter, and I'll show you how to do it in one of 2 ways, either inside using a faucet or outside using a hose spigot. To install the RODI filter indoors, you need to start by taking the faucet diverter valve. Remove the mesh filter from the faucet and screw on the diverter valve. Use the included adapter rings if needed. Unscrew the compression nut and slide it over the red tubing. Push the red RO tubing securely over the barbed output and screw the compression nut back into place. Place the blue tubing into a collection receptacle and the black tubing down the drain or into a bucket to water your plants. Before we start making filtered water for the first time, let's check the unit for leaks. To do this, go ahead and turn the diverter valve to the on position so that water is flowing into the RODI unit. Take the flush valve and turn it to the open inline position to flush the system out. This will also reduce some pressure while we're checking for leaks. Turn on the faucet and let it run for a couple minutes while checking to make sure the canisters are securely screwed in, as well as that there are no leaks where the RO tubes meet the push fittings. If there are any issues, you can use the included canister wrench to tighten the canister or just push the RO tube more securely into the fitting. Once you've determined there are no leaks, you can go ahead and turn that flush valve to the perpendicular position and you'll be making RODI water. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that Bulk Reef Supply color codes all of their RO tubes. Red is the input water line, black is the wastewater line, and blue is the clean water line. Setting up your RODI filter outdoors is even easier. The kit comes with a spigot adapter, so simply screw that onto your outdoor spigot. Then push the red tubing into the spigot adapter and installation's pretty much done. To remove RO tubing from any push connect fitting, Hold the retention ring tightly against the fitting on both sides and pull the tubing out. With the red RO tubing attached to your outdoor faucet, we just want to do our leak test again, so turn the flush valve to the parallel open position and turn the water on. Check the unit for leaks and tighten anything as necessary. Then simply turn the flush valve to the perpendicular position and the water pressure will increase inside the RO canisters and you'll be making clean water. Again, be sure you set a timer so you don't overfill your RO container. I have been told that the first time you run your RO DI filter, you should discard the first 5 gallons of clean water. It has something to do with RO membranes coming with some sort of additive to make sure mold doesn't form. So just to be on the safe side, discard those first 5 gallons of clean water you make. Eventually, you will need to change out the filtration elements in your RO system, but that shouldn't be for quite a while. All right, that is enough about water and RODI filters. It is now time to change our conversation to salt. You can't just use table salt. Seawater contains a whole plethora of major, minor, and trace elements. And of course, our hobby doesn't have just one type of seawater mix, and that's a good thing because different types of aquariums and different hobbyists have different needs from their salt. The long and short of it is this though, you can really use any pre-made saltwater mix as long as it's specifically designed for saltwater aquariums. Some of those salts will contain only pharmaceutical grade products that were made in a lab, while others will be sourced from nature. One is not necessarily better than the other, and especially for a beginner, it doesn't really matter which salt you get. Rather than go through every salt out there and their various chemical makeups, let me tell you about the 2 kinds of salt I use, and then we'll talk about how to make seawater. Oh, by the way, I use the terms saltwater and seawater interchangeably. I think I started doing this a few years back because for me, the term saltwater is a little vague. You can put any sort of salt in water and it's saltwater. Even an Epsom salt foot bath would be considered saltwater, but you couldn't use that saltwater in a saltwater aquarium. Rather, seawater is a mix specifically designed for saltwater animals, and it contains a whole bunch of different major, minor, and trace elements that are absolutely essential. When choosing the right seawater mix, there are a whole bunch of considerations, but for me, the number one most important is how cleanly it mixes. There are some salts out there that are pulled directly from natural ingredients, and because it's not 100% pure pharmaceutical grade, over time as I make batch and batch of seawater, a little brown sludge builds up on the inside of my seawater mixing bin. While that's not a huge problem, I just personally prefer not having to clean that bin out from time to time, so I want to stick with a seawater that mixes clear. Consideration number 2 is how well it stores. There are some salts on the market, something like the Red Sea Coral Pro salt, that's really high in calcium and alkalinity, and if you don't use it within a couple hours, those items will precipitate out of the water. That doesn't work for me because I will often store my seawater in my 50-gallon barrel for a month or even more, so I need something that will remain stable that entire time. The third and final consideration for me personally is the chemical makeup of the salt itself. When you start adding in corals and a lot of other inverts, they need calcium, carbonate, magnesium, and other major, minor, and trace elements to properly build their skeletal structure. For example, one of the things we measure is the buffering capacity of water, which is alkalinity. In our hobby, we usually shoot for a range of 7 to 12 DKH, also called degrees of carbonate hardness. But for me personally, I like to keep my alkalinity between 9 and 10 DKH. That way, if it goes a little bit higher or a little bit lower, I would still be in that ideal range of 7 to 12. But all that being said, I don't like to have a seawater mix that is higher in alkalinity. Why would that be? Well, it's because I dose a product called Kalkwasser to my tank. Kalkwasser, German for lime water, is a powder-based additive that is capable of dosing calcium and carbonate in one solution. I don't want to get lost in the weeds here, but know that when you add Kalkwasser to your tank, it rapidly increases the alkalinity. If I were to start with a seawater mix of 9 DKH, by the time I add my Kalkwasser in, it may push it above that 12 DKH mark. So then why do I use kalkwasser? Because I live in a home with 4 human beings, 2 cats, and 3 dogs, and all of those creatures together put out a lot of carbon dioxide into the air. High carbon dioxide levels lead to low pH levels, and low pH levels lead to corals that will struggle to build their skeletons. So I am always trying to keep my pH level up, and one way to do that is by keeping a higher alkalinity, and kalkwasser helps do that dramatically. So typically what I've been doing is I've been using a salt that has a lower alkalinity level so that I can add more kalkwasser and thus keep my pH higher and my animals healthier and happier. For the past several years, I've been using Tropic Marin Pro Reef Salt. It doesn't require any special mixing instructions. It mixes clear, and I can store it indefinitely, which is absolutely crucial for me. But that being said, a lot of my colleagues at Bulk Reef Supply have recently switched to using Nios Pure. They tell me that it mixes clear, it stores long term, and there aren't any special mixing instructions. And with a higher alkalinity starting out of around 9 for a lot of systems, it would be the ideal salt. I may try it in the future, but for now I'm just going to stick with my Tropic Marin Pro Reef Salt. Let me show you exactly how I make seawater, and then I'll show you another method that doesn't require a giant 50-gallon barrel. To make seawater, I start by pumping in freshly made RODI water from my outside storage barrel. I use the Python hook to secure it to the edge of the indoor salt mixing barrel. Then I use the app on my phone to switch on the Wi-Fi outlet, which turns on the CJ pump. I will set a timer for 10 minutes so I don't forget to check on the water level. While the water is filling up, I start adding my salt. You can follow the instructions as to exactly how much salt to add, but I've done it enough times now to know that in this 50-gallon barrel, I start with 25 cups of Tropic Marin salt. Usually this isn't quite enough, but it's a good starting point. After I've added in all 25 cups of salt, there are 2 things that I need to happen before measuring the salinity. First, the water needs to be heated, and second, it needs to be thoroughly mixed. To mix up the seawater, I just have a utility pump turned on its side on the bottom of the barrel. I think it's a CJ Syncra Silent of some kind, but really any utility pump will work. I've connected this to a smart plug so that I can turn it on and off as necessary. I usually just leave it on throughout the winter, but in the summertime, I turn it off because the pump itself will heat up the water to above 80 degrees, and that's getting a little too warm for my water changes. After I've added my 25 cups of salt, I close the lid and I let the utility pump mix it up for a couple hours. That's usually how long it takes to fully mix, and while that's happening, I also have a Eheim Jaeger heater in there, so the water will also be heating to the correct temperature. You can use any sort of heater you want, but it's a good idea to always have your seawater mixed to as close to your tank temperature as possible. That way, in case there's an emergency, the water is ready to go for a water change. After a couple hours, I will take my refractometer to measure the salinity. Usually it's a little low, around 30 parts per thousand, so I will just add more salt as needed to get up to that ideal 35 parts per thousand range. For a quick reference, I also use the Tropic Marin High Precision Hydrometer. This hydrometer is super accurate as long as the water temperature is around 77 degrees Fahrenheit. I just leave this hydrometer in my barrel so that every week when I'm doing a water change, I can just open up the lid and take a quick peek to make sure something hasn't gone wrong with the water and that it's at the correct salinity. But you don't need to do this. You could just use a refractometer to check. There are many different refractometers out there and they all work the same, but I use this one from Bulk Reef Supply and it's been a workhorse for me. I also like that the BRS refractometer comes with calibration fluid because, believe it or not, you need to occasionally calibrate, at least for the first time, to double check that the salinity readings are correct. To use a refractometer, simply place a few drops of seawater onto the prism surface. Then lower the top onto the prism surface to make sure the seawater spreads out all across the prism. Then place the viewing unit up to your eye and hold the refractometer in direct light. You'll be able to see a blue line inside that will tell you the salinity of the seawater. When you are finished, just be sure to rinse everything with fresh water so that it's ready for the next time. It's important that the seawater is as close to tank temperature as possible because temperature does influence the salinity reading. If your seawater happens to be cold, then just put the drops of seawater onto the refractometer, go into a warm room, wait 30 to 45 seconds, and then do your reading. With my seawater pre-made, it's really easy for me to do water changes or to fill up the tank for the first time, especially since I have a CJ Ultra Zero utility pump pump in the bottom of my bin, which is attached to a garden hose and a Python hook, so I can just hook it over the side of my tank. Before using the Python hook, I would just take the flexible tubing and a clamp to the side of the tank, but so many times that ended up on the ground with salt water everywhere that I finally just invested in the Python. But Matthew, I don't have space for a 50-gallon barrel of pre-made salt water, so how do I make seawater? Well, you can just use a simple 5-gallon bucket, or you could use a 20 to 32-gallon brute trash can, even put a dolly on the bottom of it so you could wheel it around your home easily. Just be sure whatever container you use, it's only used for seawater. For example, don't go out and use a 5-gallon bucket that previously had paint in it. We just don't want to mix those things in our tank. Simply add freshly made RODI water into your bucket and follow the mixing instructions on the back of the box of salt mix to get the approximate amount of dry salt to add. You could just grab something to stir it with manually, or you could use one of those return pumps included with the RF45. Simply place one of those pumps on its side in the bottom of the bucket. Don't put it upright because then water will probably just spray out the top of your bucket. Plug it in while adding your salt mix, and this should mix everything up really nicely. Okay, you've made your seawater and it's finally time to add it to your tank. I am extremely excited for this because it's the first time we will have a fully functioning saltwater aquarium. There really isn't anything super special about adding water to your tank other than we're trying to avoid creating a sandstorm. A sandstorm isn't necessarily terrible at this point, but it just takes a lot longer to clear up. So here are a few different ways you could fill up your tank to avoid that huge sandstorm. Using my garden hose, Seche Ultra Zero, and Python, I just hang the Python into the rear filtration chamber and then let water fill up that chamber. Once it's full, it will just trickle down the rear baffle and into the display tank. It will likely cause a little sand near the back baffle to get stirred up, but it shouldn't be a big deal. The second thing you could do is scoop water directly onto the aquascape itself, and that should disperse it enough as to not cause a huge sandstorm. You could also pour the water directly into a colander, and that would disperse it as well. But at the end of the day, if you end up getting a big sandstorm, it's not a big deal. You can always put your hand in to redo the sand bed, and we also still have that water clarifier pouch that will help clear things up quickly. With our tank now full of water, it is time to officially turn on our Access 40 return pumps. We will need to plug them in and set them up in the Mobius app. The first thing you need to do obviously is to download the Mobius app and set up your free account. Once you've logged in and created a new tank, then you need to add gear. This is super simple, and as soon as you plug in your Access 40 pumps, they should be easily discoverable. Just follow the instructions on Mobius, and you could calibrate it, or you could skip that for now. Be sure both of your filter socks are in place, because these will help collect that sediment that we stirred up when adding salt water to the tank. We're going to dial in the exact amount of flow later, but for now, I'm going to set my Access pumps using a template, constant speed, and set it for low. This is good enough to keep the water circulating, but to be honest, we may need to turn it down in the future because I think it's probably a bit too much flow still. Once both the pumps are plugged in and running in the Mobius app, you will need to double check that there's enough seawater in the tank. To do this, look into the rear filtration chamber. The only chamber that is going to have a variable water height is the central return pump chamber. All the other chambers will maintain a constant water height. So once the pumps are turned on, look into that rear central chamber and add more seawater as necessary so that it reaches those two side baffles. Until we set up our auto top off unit, you're gonna have to come every day and add RODI water, not salt water, to the tank to replace the evaporation. If you add salt water to the tank, it will get saltier and saltier because salt doesn't evaporate, only the fresh water evaporates. So every day when you look into that rear central chamber, just add some RODI water to make sure it's up to the level of those baffles. That way the pumps don't run dry and the water doesn't get too salty. This will get super annoying really fast, but don't worry, we will show you how to set up an auto top off unit shortly. For now, I'm just going to overfill my tank a little bit with RODI water so I don't have to refill it every day. Just be sure if you do that, you still check that real chamber because you might get out of the habit and then the water might get too low when you're not checking it. The seawater has been added, the pumps have been turned on and set with the Mobius app. We've made sure the water level is correct and learned how to top off your tank with RODI water every day. It's time to finally add that water clarifier pouch that came in the bag of sand. Nothing fancy here, just use a pair of scissors to open up the water clarifier pouch and dump it into the display tank. As long as your filter socks are in place, your tank will probably clear up in about 24 hours, so just be a little patient. After those 24 hours are complete, it's probably a good idea to rinse out those filter socks. I actually have a whole bunch of extra filter socks because I hate cleaning them every week, and I highly recommend you pick up a whole bunch extra as well. But until you get extra filter socks, you could just pull them out of the tank, flip them inside out, and give them a good rinse and squeeze with tap water, then replace them into your tank. Doing this will help remove all of that sediment that was collected and make the filtration run much more efficiently. Now, with your tank full of water, in the future, when you do water changes, you want to make sure your fresh batches of seawater are heated to 77 degrees, so you will need to purchase another heater. I have a whole bunch of these Eheim Jaeger heaters lying around, but really any old heater will work just fine. But for the tank, I am going to use the BRS titanium heater paired with an Inkbird temperature controller. I use temperature controllers on all of my tanks. It gives me an immense peace of mind knowing that the water temperature is always going to be stable and that if it gets too cold or too hot, a verbal alarm will alert me so that I can fix the problem immediately. To be honest, a temperature controller has saved my butt more times than I can count. Using the BRS titanium heater actually requires the use of a controller because there is no control on the heater itself. This is different than something like an Eheim Jaeger, which actually has a temperature control setting. The biggest thing you need to remember when heating your tank, well, actually, the two biggest things you need to remember are first, get the correct size heater. Oftentimes we think, and oftentimes it's true, that more power equals more better, but that is absolutely not the case when it comes to heaters. Heaters are mechanical things and will eventually fail, and they can fail in the on position or in the off position. If they fail in the off position, as long as your tank is in a room around 70 degrees, then the water temperature will likely not fall any more than that. While it's not good for your animals, it's probably not going to be deadly. But if your heater fails in the on position, if you have a heater that is way too big for your tank, the temperature could rise way too high and be deadly for all of your animals. So what we do is we get a heater that is the correct size. That way, if it fails in the on position, yes, the temperature might go to 80, 82 degrees, but probably not a lot higher than that. For this build, I'm using the 100 watt titanium version, which is rated for tanks up to 40 gallons. For me, this heater works perfectly because our house rarely goes below 70 degrees, but if your saltwater tank's in a cold room, let's say 65 degrees or less, you may need to get a larger heater. The second important consideration when it comes to heaters is where to place it. The worst thing that can happen to a heater is that it is exposed to air while in the on position. So it needs to be placed in a part of the tank where it will always be covered with water. That means for our RF45, we are going to place the heater in the second chamber, the one directly next to the filter socks. You can't place it in the central rear chamber that houses the return pumps because it has a variable water height. And if you forget to top off your tank or your auto top off unit fails in the future, this could expose the heater to air and cause immense problems. So to avoid that, we're going to place our heater in one of the two second chambers, the ones next to the filter socks that have that black sponge at the bottom. Just be sure you push the heater all the way to the bottom of the chamber and use the suction cup mounts to stick it to the back glass panel. As long as the heater is below the baffle here, it will always be underneath the water line and thus safe. Then I'm going to install the Inkbird temperature controller into my cabinet stand. I'll probably eventually mount it to the inside of the stand, but for now, I'm just gonna set it on top of the shelf. Speaking of which, I use Wi-Fi controllable outlets for all of my tanks. It's the easiest way I have found to control various pieces of gear. I just picked these up at Amazon, and I don't think this version is for sale anymore, but just type in Wi-Fi outlet and there are a whole bunch of options available. Really, I use these primarily when doing my water changes, and sometimes I'll use them when feeding my animals. That way I can turn off the pump and set a timer so that it will automatically turn back on in 15 or 20 minutes. With the titanium heater installed and the Wi-Fi temperature controller plugged in, I'm now going to attach the heater to the temperature controller. I'm actually using the Wi-Fi capable Inkbird controller, but in the past I found it so glitchy that I don't even worry about the Wi-Fi and just rely on the manual settings. The nice part of using the Inkbird app is you can set up alerts that will come to your phone if there's a temperature problem, but since I'm pretty much always at home anyways, I can usually just listen for the audio sound and then I know there's a problem. Plug in the titanium heater to the heating portion. You'll also notice if you've got the Inkbird version I do that there's a cooling outlet as well, which is super handy for me because in the summertime my tank gets too hot. So I actually plug a fan into the cooling element so that it will click on when my tank gets too warm. With the heater plugged in, you need to place the temperature probe for the Inkbird controller into the correct location in your tank. Ideally, you want the temperature probe to be in the display portion itself. Why would that be? Well, because the display tank temperature could actually be quite different from the temperature in the rear filtration chamber. For example, if your pumps were to be accidentally left in the off position and you had that temperature probe placed in the same compartment as your heater, then the heater would think your entire tank is warm because it's turning on and off and heating that one chamber, while the rest of the aquarium would be getting colder and colder. So what I'm gonna do is install the temperature probe in the display tank itself. I'm not doing anything fancy here. You could purchase some sort of probe holder, but my goal is just to make it look as minimal as possible. So I'm literally going to tie a loose knot with the temperature probe around the output nozzle here. This actually works really well, and I've done it in my Hello Reef tank because the temperature probe is black, it blends nicely into the rear baffle so you barely even notice it, and I know I'm getting a true temperature reading from my display tank. Depending on which temperature controller you end up going with, the instructions might be a little different, but there's gonna be a few parameters you need to set. The first thing you wanna do is set your standard temperature. I'm gonna set mine to 77 degrees. Then you need to set your cold and heat differential. Basically, that means when will the temperature controller activate your titanium heater. I like to keep mine within a margin of 1 degree so that my heater clicks on at 76 degrees and then turns off at 78 degrees. So this will keep my aquarium temperature 76 to 78 degrees, which is a perfect temperature. Lastly, you may want to calibrate your temperature controller. Sometimes they can be off by a degree, which honestly probably doesn't matter. But if you want to calibrate it, just use a high precision thermometer to check the temperature and then make the adjustments in the Inkbird controller itself. Okay, you have your heater installed and it's attached to a properly calibrated temperature controller. Now it's time to add the second heater. You may be wondering why we would do that. Well, it's actually a redundant safety measure. Every heater will eventually give out. I believe these titanium heaters from BRS come with a 3-year warranty and they'll probably last a lot longer than that. But if and when that heater eventually goes out, it would be terrible if you were gone for a few days and you came back to a super cold tank. So as a backup, we add a secondary heater that will turn on when the tank reaches 74, 75 degrees. We set it to this temperature so that 1, it will save your animals from getting too cold, and 2, it will still trigger the Inkbird alarm, which is set to turn on at 75 degrees. For this, I usually use an inexpensive Jaeger heater. I simply install it next to the other heater, making sure it will always be fully submerged in the correct rear filtration chamber, and I set it for 74 degrees. It will rarely, if ever, turn on, and it's good to know it's there in case my primary heater goes out. I'm also going to add a stick-on thermometer. I know that these aren't the most accurate, but I like them because I can just turn around every day and make sure my temperature is in the correct range. I like to install this BRS sticker near the rear of the tank so it sort of blends into the rear filtration chamber, and when you're looking at it, the green means the current temperature, blue means the lower end, and orange means the higher end. So if you see 3 colors, the green is the correct temperature, but if you only see the blue and orange temperature colors, then the actual temperature is in between those two. It's nothing fancy, but it will give you a quick visual to check your temperature every day. Phew, that was a doozy of an episode. Coming up in episode 4, we are going to teach you how to cycle your tank, install an auto top-off unit, walk you through how filtration works, get the lights dialed in, and create a DIY screen top. Click here for a link to the entire playlist, and until next time, be well and happy reefing, everybody.